Started my first startup in 97. The world told me I was insane.
Our goal is creating future economies that are more regenerative and sustainable.
Something didn't match up. Why hasn't this become the next big thing? And that's where we invested.
The whole purpose of achieving anything in life is measurement.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. We've got an exciting panel discussion today. The topic is raising your ESG profile with data, goals, and disclosure. So from investors, regulators, and customers, there's growing pressure to disclose more detailed information about climate impact, labor risks, and government governance mechanisms with greater frequency and accuracy. So today we'll talk to our panels about changing demands for more ESG information, strategic approaches to capturing this info, and using ESG data to build loyalty and confidence in their companies. So first, I'd like to introduce Pam Fitzpatrick. She is the head of ESG Center of Excellence at OneTrust. And Pam joined OneTrust as head of the ESG Center of Excellence in 2021. She has 2 decades of experience in helping businesses operate more sustainably and contribute to social impact and community renewal. Before arriving at OneTrust, she was Vice President Sustainability at Macy's, where she launched and led programs in sustainable products, responsible sourcing, and ESG disclosure. Previously, she was Senior Director at Gartner, where she launched their supply chain practices research and advisory services on sustainability and circular economy. In this role, she also advised senior leaders in Fortune 500 companies on how to plan and execute sustainability and circular economy strategies, develop government frameworks, and advance in their sustainability journey. She has a BA in English from Allegheny College and a Master of Public Administration from Barrett College. And we'd like to welcome Pam Fitzpatrick to the panel.
Thanks, Ian.
We've also got Abe Kruger. So Abe is co-founder and president of a leading national sustainability and healthy housing consulting firm. Abe leverages his 17 years of construction expertise to help clients make their projects as efficient, durable, sustainable, and healthy as possible. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Pam and Abe to have a discussion on ESG data. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks, everyone, for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon. Our goal is to kind of go through some content. Obviously, this is not a full panel, it's more of a dialogue. And I have some questions for Abe so we could tap into his expertise. But I think we also plan to open it up to questions at the end or even during. So feel free to post your questions as we have a conversation. If we can see them easily and pivot to them as we talk, then we will do that. Or if that's a little challenging technologically, I think we're all kind of learning to juggle multiple technology platforms for conferencing over the past few months. But if it turns out to be a slight technological challenge, then we'll save questions to the end, but we will intend to answer them. So thanks very much, and feel free to keep the questions flowing. So Abe, let's get things started a little bit with just a context setter. Obviously, sustainability, not necessarily a new term, not new to this industry at all, but things seem to be at sort of a heightened sense of discussion these days. What is driving the focus and importance of ESG and sustainability now?
Yeah, so our focus is on the E portion of the ESG, so the environmental part. And we're the third-party verifiers that go out. And so when a business has a ESG reporting either requirement or initiative, that's kind of where our piece kind of falls into it. From our perspective, there's a lot of different drivers for this, but the big one is going to be the investors, the institutional investors, the folks with the purse strings are asking for it. In preparation for this, I came across a Morgan Stanley report where it was like 95% of millennials care about sustainability. They want to see ESG reports. They want to know that their investments matter and are not, they don't want to do evil, right? Think back to the Google motto, do no evil. And so that's the big drivers for a lot of these developments. The people with the money want to see sustainability initiatives. They want to see data related to that. so that they can then take credit for it.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of it, to add on to that, Abe, I think a big part of what you hear and what we've heard over the past several years around sort of tracking with that uptake in ESG investing you're describing is a focus on long-term value, and this understanding that if we're protecting resources for their longevity, for the planet, if we're looking out for our people, another asset that every one of our companies has, that we are going to be better positioned to deliver value over the long term. And I think it's that narrative, right, that's kind of becoming increasingly popular, and that businesses are in a position to really highlight by virtue of saying, you know what, you can count on us for the long term because we're managing the E well, we're managing the S well, and we're doing that with good G, the governance piece in place. So I think you're totally right, though. It is, you know, we've had activism in various forms going on for a long time. And certainly if you've done work in communities, and we'll talk about that from your perspective as we talk today, you know that there's been community-based activism around environmental protection. There's been regulation, but I think the fact that big money, that BlackRock, that State Street, that Fidelity, the institutional investors that own most publicly traded companies in America are driving this focus, it just becomes impossible to ignore.
Well, it's also, it's good for business, right?
Yeah.
It's a good business decision, and no matter which way you slice it. So a lot of our developments also are using Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or HUD loans, and they all have green building incentive programs now. So HUD has a mortgage insurance premium reduction for multifamily properties that are green certified. And the question is, why does HUD do this? Why does Fannie Mae do this? And it's because the data is showing them that these are less risky investments.
That's
These
it, yeah.
loans are better investments. They're going to be less likely to default because the residents are going to be able to pay their rent on time, more likely.
Always helpful. Always helpful to have the cash flows. So just going back to, we mentioned sustainability is not new to the business industry or the building industry. Certainly like LEED certification has been sort of popular for decades. The focus has been there for a while. What else is different now, Abe, than how it has played out in the past few decades? What's changing?
It's data. And what I think it is we've now got, some good history now within like commercial spaces. So office buildings looking at increased productivity within LEED certified buildings, reduced sick days of employees within LEED certified buildings, better employee retention as a LEED certified building. We have similar stats coming out of schools. So those kind of were like the trailblazers in terms of the data. Now, finally, the residential sector, we're coming along and we're saying, we've got data too. So for a while, it had to be just kind of, it was kind of intuitive. You're like, well, if this was good for your employees, it's probably good for your residents. But now we've got folks like Fannie Mae partnering with ResNet, the Residential Energy Services Network, who oversees the HERS industry, to look at single family mortgages on properties that received HERS ratings. And they're finding that they default less and they're selling for more. There's a sales premium. So there's real value in the HERS rating. Fannie Mae is getting the same data out of their multifamily portfolio. Of these are just better performing investments. So I would say this time around, I talked to folks who are like, oh, in 2000 it was peak LEED. And I'm like, yeah, and this time we just have better data. And I think this really has legs for the long term. And I think people can't ignore climate change anymore. Like it impacts your business. Like you've got to consider it in your decision making.
That's interesting. So the notion of like, previously maybe the data was more around just like counting the number of LEED certified buildings or the square footage of LEED certified buildings. Now we're actually seeing, well, what is the impact? What are the outcomes that come from operating a LEED certified space, right? From both on a quality of life standpoint for the residents or for tenants. So it's an interesting way of looking at it. There's been enough time there to see a bigger outcome.
Oh yeah, I mean, we've got the studies around, employee productivity in these buildings. It's tremendous.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a large corporation with a big office building, you can now put dollars and cents to develop your ROI on these sorts of investments, and it's tremendous. When you think about what's your utility bill, it doesn't matter. For a big company, right? It's such a fraction of their budget. 90% is going towards their workforce, and so if they can show that they're improving productivity, that return is going to be so much better than anything you would get on higher efficiency light bulbs. So that's part of it too, is when we calculate ROI in the commercial space, it's less about the utility bills, and the conversation is much more about the employees and retention and productivity.
Well, that's an interesting, the people dimension of it, I think, is another piece that's worthy of discussion here when we talk about ESG, right? And I think it is important that we kind of widen our horizon when we think about ESG, that we're not all in on the E, but neglecting to look at the S and the G piece. And I think another sort of what's considered a material factor, if you're looking at this from, if you're motivated to do this because you believe that your investors are interested in it, or the investors of your customers are interested in it, which is another piece, right? Which is where do we all fit in one another's supply chains, and how are we accountable to one another as we're reporting out on this information? But I think if we look even within the building industry or the construction industry, or in even production of building materials, that we'll find that if you dig into what investors are actually looking for, yes, they want to know your environmental impact, but also they want to know what's your health and safety record. How many, what's your what labor issues may you have going on within your own operations? And do you have a good sense of what those risks may be, and how well are you managing them? So the S piece, I think it's important to note, goes beyond, yes, definitely the people in the buildings, right? Sort of the end finished product, but also the people that are actually making that building happen, that are constructing that building. There's a greater sense of, particularly around today's labor force conditions, where we may have people with different sort of citizenship status, maybe coming from different countries of origin, having a good command of all of that data and understanding the conditions and creating safe conditions for your workforce is becoming increasingly important too. So if you've got your employee health and safety training record, it's strong record keeping, I think that is a valuable part of those investor conversations as well. Would you agree? Is there anything that you would want to add on from that perspective?
I think that's all great. And when I think about society as well, I think about what's the immediate impact on the surrounding communities. And so I think part of this might be, and this is a little cynical of me, just a change in accounting, in the sense that big multifamily developers, or big developers in general, they oftentimes entered into public benefits or community benefit agreements. Yes. And so now this is a way to better quantify that and take more credit for it. I think about a development in my community, in my neighborhood, where I was on a call last night and they were talking about the green space that'll be public access. I'm like, oh, that's so cool. And they're like, oh, I'm sure you're going to take credit for that in some ESG report. You're a big publicly traded developer. You're going to be milking this for all it's worth. And this
Sure.
is not costing you a whole lot of money.
So win-wins though, right?
Exactly.
And there's nothing wrong with that, so long as it's a win and a win. If someone coming, we mentioned in my bio that I have a background in sort of sustainable development. Abe and I were talking previously. I worked in community development at a CDC for several years, so I'm familiar with those incentives and opportunities that can come from doing community-based work, for sure. Let's move on to just another question about, you talked about the data as it related to LEED certifications or some other ESG just related data points or indicators. How well is our industry doing in capturing and managing and leveraging that data as part of our work?
Well, first, at least on my screen, you've gone gray. I don't know if you're.
Oh.
Can you still see yourself? It might be my internet.
Yeah, I
you still see
can.
me? Okay.
I can see us both. Is it good
Okay.
on your end? Any
I
better?
can see only me, which is weird.
Okay.
I can still see both of you.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Must be me. Thank you for confirming. That's my colleague, Sarah. So how well are we doing at capturing, and now I can see you.
Oh, good.
We just needed Sarah to pop in. Thank you for fixing it. I think we're doing okay. It's kind of the short answer. I think there's certain things that are relatively easy. And those are, hitting a checkbox of, is it green certified? Did you do third-party verification? That's a pretty easy thing to quantify. The utility consumption, that's pretty easy to quantify. It gets a little trickier in multifamily when it's all sub-metered, but more and more utilities will share the data in aggregate, anonymized for a property. So you can get that and put it into Portfolio Manager and know that here are the bills for your 100 properties, and you can benchmark it. So that data, I think, is pretty good. Where it gets harder is when you're talking about like indoor air quality. And that's where, okay, are you putting a IAQ monitor in every unit? What's the data you're getting there? That's a little trickier. And then kind of taking this data and saying, well, how are you impacting people's lives? That's where it gets very hard. And that's where like the literature and the research is still occurring.
Yeah, to that point, I think one of the big questions that people can run into when they're on this journey is like, what is the data that really matters, right? Like there are certain things we know are good for us to capture and share. Maybe they help us be more efficient. Maybe they help us with our marketing. But for those on this discussion that are looking for guidance on, I want to meet changing expectations about reporting on ESG performance. What is it that matters? I would encourage you to get familiar with the standards issued by SASB if you haven't done that already. That's the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. SASB is now part of what's known as the Value Reporting Foundation, which is the merger of two related sustainability reporting organizations, SASB and the IARC, which is traditionally advocated for integrated reporting, taking all of that ESG data and putting it in your standard financial reporting. SASB has helped, I think, tremendously take this vast number of potential indicators that we could measure our sustainability or ESG performance on and shrink it down to what they believe or what their process has led to the conclusion of saying these are the indicators that should matter most to investors because they are related. They have a material impact on your financial performance. So if you're not familiar with SASB standards for whatever your part of the sort of subsector of the industry is, they have 77 different standards. You can find them on SASB's materiality map, which kind of provides a grid look to say within your sector, here are the 4 or 5 areas that matter in your sustainability reporting, and here are the indicators that you should be capturing and reporting out on. And they get very specific on, energy consumption from the grid versus renewables, like really details. And I think it can help kind of take this big greenfield, if you will, of like ESG data and reporting and say, well, where do I get started? We'll start with the stuff that is material. Start with the stuff that your customers are asking for. Start with the stuff that your investors are asking for. Start with the stuff that will help you capture and retain good talent as well, which is another piece that we talked about a little bit, Abe, in terms of like what's changing. Can you shed any light on just kind of your perspective on changing expectations from employees and what matters to them?
Yes. Oh, just going back to your previous comment, though, I think identifying a framework is key. Don't go trying to reinvent the wheel here. find a program to work within and find one that fits with your goals. So I think SASB is exactly step one. It's just like with green building. Don't try to create your own label. Just use National Green Building Standard, use LEED, use one of the established programs. They've got the credibility, they've got the framework, they've done the legwork for you. But also as, as a small business, this stuff is really important. And as part of how we're able to, for us to attract and retain good talent, good coworkers, is by helping to show like we're not a religious organization by any means, but we are passionate and we are mission driven. We truly want to make the world better through improving the built environment. That is our focus, and it's great because yes, days are hard. Yes, it's not always glamorous. Some days you're in crawl spaces, but at the end of the day, we know we're making buildings better, and that's benefiting the world, the climate. It's benefiting the residents, the homeowners. So that's a big part for us, because we know as a small business, we're not going to be able to offer always the best, compensation, right? Just to be real. There's always going to be someone who can pay more, but if we can kind of help align goals and mission and can really create a good, engaging team environment, that's been key for us.
That, you're tapping into what I've been reading a lot about over the past couple of years, which is this notion of having a sense of purpose. And I think the ESG data that you're collecting can help demonstrate that sense of purpose. Like, this is how we are holding ourselves accountable for making an impact in the communities in which we operate, to your point earlier, on the planet, in society as a whole, in our regional economy, however you want to frame that sense of purpose. But that the notion of collecting that data, I think, and sharing that data with potential employees and your current employees kind of does a couple of things. One, it says we are holding ourselves accountable. We're committed to transparency. And I think increasingly transparency is seen as an absolute prerequisite for building trust in business, right? If we want to hold on or build, demonstrate or build relationships of trust, that is relationships that are going to last, relationships that are resilient through thick and thin, it's got to start with transparency and capturing that data and sharing that data on a regular basis, on a frequent basis, is going to help lay the groundwork for this trustful relationships. But I think we also know, I'm just actually looking for a stat that I used maybe a year or so ago, like a study that I looked at last year said that 61% of millennials and 63% of Gen Z expect their employers to limit their environmental impact. So that's the majority. That's more than half. That's like table stakes now. So if you can demonstrate to compelling candidates that here's what we're doing and here's how we measure that, that's just going to position you really well. If they may be considering, obviously the best talent may be considering multiple offers. So how do you create that story that you could share? So big point being, like, your ESG data is not just for your investors or your customers that are asking for it. If you collect the right things, if you link it to what Abe was describing as like a mission or a sense of purpose, it can become part of your recruiting package too. So don't underestimate the value of that.
Well, and it's like, so you get better employees. So that's good. That's good for business. You retain the employees. Well, it's expensive to replace people. Right?
That's right.
It's just the fact. But it's also like in the corporate world, it's interesting to see the data about like the impact of having a diverse board of directors. Like more diverse boards, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, tends to lead to better performance. More diversity amongst corporate officers tends to lead to better performing companies. When you look at like Fortune 500 companies and publicly traded firms, like that tends to be the reality, is when you have more opinions and more diversity of thought, companies tend to perform better. Well,
and I think that's another, you're bringing up a great point. I think it's another thing job candidates are looking at now too, anecdotally, right? And I don't have a data point for that one, though I do have another data point I will share in a moment. But I think the expectation is if they're looking at your C-suite and they're looking at the board of directors, they want to see that they can be sitting there too one day, that they have a ladder that exists within your organization. And if they don't see it now, it kind of may rule out they may have the perception that it's not an opportunity for them in the future. So kind of getting off of ESG data, but recognize that to some stakeholders, that data might come in many forms, and it may not always be a number. It may be what they see when they look at your website. So keep that in mind as well. I do want to share one more data point going back to the idea of like attracting millennials and Gen Z and to get to the point that Abe was making about actually keeping them in your organization too. That retention is really important to managing costs. So we talked about 61% and 63% expecting their employers to limit their environmental impact. When we talk about making a positive community impact, the numbers go even higher. So 69% of millennials and 70% of Gen Z want their employers to make a positive community impact. And I think increasingly, it's not just like we do this philanthropic thing over on the side. Like they actually want to take part in it in their everyday work. So again, to the degree to which you can articulate that by capturing data that describes your positive community impact, capturing data that describes how you're limiting your environmental footprint, it just creates a really compelling case on why they would want to come work for your business.
Oh yeah, I mean, exactly. These are good business decisions. Again, we have a volunteer time off policy, VTO, and we organize volunteer days. And it's like, it's good to give back to the community, but it's also been really valuable just having that team building time as well. Mm-hmm. Because we tend to do inspections in teams whenever there's like testing required. We're spending a lot of time together, but then we're also spending big stretches of time just working at home, sitting at a computer. My colleagues, we split our time in the field and just admin, and that opportunities to work together and just shoot the shit, just hear about your day and your weekend. It's great.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. I'm missing that during these COVID days, that's for sure.
We've been going to community gardens. It's all outdoors now.
Yes, exactly. So let's go back. We know we've talked about all the reasons why people should be capturing and sharing this information. We talked a little bit about if you're just getting started on pulling this information together, the idea of understand who are the stakeholders with whom you want to share this information, and what are the frameworks that you're aware of that will help you focus on, even if you're starting kind of small with a limited number of indicators, that at least you're working from an existing credible framework rather than starting from scratch and making up your own ways of measuring. Are there any other kind of tips you might offer, Abe, on how to get started or things you should think about at the beginning of your ESG data collection journey?
I mean, I think that's the big thing is it's the kind of figuring out your ultimate goal, right? So that you can come up with that framework, that vehicle that will help you get there. And this journey is going to look different for different types of companies. So if you're an apartment developer with a large portfolio of rental properties, step one is going to be figuring out kind of benchmarking or baselining your portfolio. So really figuring out kind of where are you now in terms of utility consumption, in terms of like trash or recycling, looking at how do you quantify your existing impact. And that way you can then start moving that needle. So you can say, okay, this year our goal is a 5% reduction in energy consumption in our utilities, in our common spaces. Or we're looking to increase our recycling participation amongst our residents by X amount. So that's kind of one scenario. If you're a big general contractor building properties, it might be that you figure out, okay, how many of the projects that we do are green certified? Well, it might be 80%, or it might be 20%. Maybe it's you want to move that along, or maybe you want to make a commitment that all the projects you build receive some sort of third-party verification. It might be that you're just looking at construction waste. That's a big number. The amount of tons that just go to landfill and moving that needle to how much is getting diverted to recycling or reuse facilities. So depending on kind of exactly your industry, this journey is going to look a bit different.
That's a great point. That's a great point. What about, obviously no journey is without its difficulties. What kinds of obstacles or challenges should someone, especially at the beginning stages, expect to encounter? And if there are any strategies we could recommend for overcoming those challenges?
There's going to be a lot of challenges for sure, but I think it's going to be finding the right partners. And so one thing is, there's an industry now of ESG consultants. That's one place to go. If you're a developer who's really worried about, how do I improve my work product, my buildings? Well, it's going to be green building consultants, healthy housing consultants. That's where to go. But there's also, firms that specialize now in construction waste recycling and reuse. So finding the right partners for those different aspects and is really building that team. It's not unlike just the green building process of, step one, assemble the right team. Step two, get the team talking, so that you can have this collaborative and then iterative process. And just realize you're not going to get it right from the start. That's fine. There's only up, so really we're focused on figuring out kind of what is your current practice, and then every year, maybe every quarter, whatever you want, showing that incremental improvement so that you can kind of have that end goal and show progress getting there.
I think that's a great point. And I'll add on maybe a couple observations from my work with companies as they're doing this data management process. Really is what it is, right? It's first of all understanding like who owns the data in our organization, because it may not sit with one person. If only it did, it would make things a lot easier. If you could just go to that person and say, can I please have this? And it's all tidy and organized, but that's never usually the case. It's usually different owners, particularly if you're a larger organization with multiple divisions or multiple sites, different offices, different functions. The data that you need to report out on to address your stakeholders' needs may be sitting and owned by different people, and it may not be normalized. They may be collecting it with different indicators today. Someone may be measuring X, someone else may be measuring it X squared minus Y. So it's focused in the same topic area, but calculated slightly differently. So I think one of the ways to get around that or start to begin to think about it is like just doing some data mapping. Like in my last organization, myself and a couple of my team members spent time just figuring out if these are we want to use SASB standards, and here's what SASB is asking for. Who owns it? And how frequently does that data change? And what do they have it in today? Is it in an Excel spreadsheet that's sitting on only their laptop, or is it connected in some sort of larger data management system? Like, even if you're manually writing out a map, which is what we did, beginning to kind of pull that vision together of where all the data sits, who owns it, and how dynamic it is will help you begin and do that in the off season, as I say, like not when you're trying to produce a sustainability report, but in that time between your sustainability or ESG reports, like use that time to sort of get to know where it all sits and how it's all managed. I think the other piece that gets tricky is trying to figure out like what are we willing to share right now. And disclosure, sharing all of this data, like sounds easy in theory. It's like, oh, here it is, and we're just going to publish it. But in reality, there's a lot of sensitivity around some of this data, and it's not always comfortable releasing it in the public domain because we don't know, how is it going to compare with our competitors, or what are our investors what judgment will they make when they see this data? And I think another practice I would recommend, and Abe, if you have something to add on here too, that would be great, of like just starting to make decisions and having this is where the governance piece comes in, like understanding who gets to make decisions about what we release through our disclosures or sustainability reporting is really important. And having clarity on who gets to sit at that decision-making table, just come up with the agreements. So if you're publicly traded, you want to have your investor relations leaders sitting at that decision-making table to help everyone understand the implications of releasing certain data into the public domain. You probably want to have someone from finance and legal and communication. So if you're an organization that has that sort of different functional leaders, create a disclosure committee or some mechanism that brings people together. Maybe it's your executive committee that makes the decision on what to release, and know that you, just because a standard is asking for you to release everything, you don't have to do it all at once. Like figure out what your comfort level is with sharing that information. Do you have anything to add to that, Abe?
Well, I think it can't just be like Pam doing all of this.
That's right. That's right.
Like,
That's totally right.
How are you establishing goals? How are you getting buy-in? So and there's a couple steps to that, right? It's one, it's buy-in so that stuff actually gets done. But then also, how do you like build excitement for this? You know, it's like you want people to care and to be excited for this. And so you never want to be like the token person trying to fight the good fight. It needs to be a team effort. So I think that's part of it. And how are those decisions being made? When you were talking, one thing that came to my mind was like, there's also like interesting partnerships that can grow out of this. And I'll give the example of like healthcare. You know, it's like you think about a lot of corporations that like, there was a big trend for a little while where they were giving out free like pedometers and like competitions for Fitbits and like encouraging healthy habits. Well, it's like, one, it was probably getting a break on the insurance, but also it was a great story. We're trying to help our employees be healthier. So again, kind of looking to some of your external existing relationships to see if there's an opportunity there, because that's also really good data. You know, we're getting ready to look at, so we do mileage reimbursement for our staff, but we don't actually like put it into like an Excel sheet or tracking. So like, I could not tell you easily how many miles we drive for work a year, but that's something we really want to figure out, is we want to know the associated emissions from all those automobile miles. But it's like, we have to like decide, do we really want to do this? Is this going to be a pain? Because I know we did not start our system for this. So it's going to be a pain to get this data. And we better believe it's important. I think we've decided it's worthwhile, but it's going to be an off-season exercise. But you know, there's certain things where it's like, it would be nice to have, but it's not essential. You know, like, oh, this would be really cool if we knew X, Y, and Z. And it's like, oh, that would be a huge lift, and people aren't going to enjoy the process, and the end story might not actually be that appealing to anyone. Let's not even bother.
Well, that goes back to your original point of like, know your goals when you start. And if the goal is to be able to communicate your environmental impact in this way, then that's where that drive comes from. I think that's a great way of pulling it all together. Another question, how are companies using technology to do this work? Is that part of the solution as well?
I think it is. And we're seeing it, at like the vendor level, some of it. So, or like the suppliers. So some of this is you're just getting the data from, you know, are you using local brick? All right. So like, what's the environmental impact of the brick pavers you're using? Well, they now are, so those vendors, the manufacturers, are better equipped now to provide those sort of environmental declarations. So they can give those impact stuff. More and more waste haulers are set up to tell you, you know, the tonnage and where it's going and things like that. There's tools like Green Badger that is for lead administration. And it is so if people are familiar with Lead Online, I think their like unofficial byline is, you know, like, it's the way Lead Online likes to think it works. So it's very user friendly. It's very intuitive. And it's a software tool for like GCs to track all the documentation affiliated with the LEED process. So we're seeing tools like that pop up.
Nice. I will take 1 second to say I work for a company that makes technology that's helping organizations collect and manage their ESG data. So we are hopeful that there will be more use of technology doing that work going forward. And I think it does, as the data becomes more, and what part of what made me excited about joining this organization is the data becomes more integral to our daily work, to our daily relationship management with our customers, with our investors, with our employees, with our communities. I think our ability to have credible data at our fingertips is going to be increasingly important. Another question or so before we flip over to see if we have any questions from our audience, and that is, if you're already doing ESG reporting, like, how do you make it more impactful? What's next? What does advanced look like?
That's a great question. So, I'll say the vast majority of the projects we work on are at like a minimum certification level. So if you think about LEED as LEED certified or NGBS bronze. So they're in that spot of like 15 to 25% better than code. So commendable, but that is not, the end goal, I would say, for the true believers in the crowd and where we really need to be kind of as a society. But that's a great first step. So there's always more you can do in terms of, instead of bronze, go for silver. Instead of silver, go for gold. Go for higher tier certifications. Or we've got a really strong sustainability program. We've figured out National Green Building Standard. We're going to layer in Fitwell, or we're going to layer in WELL, which are more health-focused building certifications. So you can kind of take that approach. We're seeing a lot of interest in net zero energy. So how do you get the building pretty much as efficient as possible and then add on-site renewables, so solar panels. So you can keep pushing it. And there's a certification called the Living Building Challenge, where it's looking at not only net positive energy, meaning over the course of a year, you're producing more energy than you use on site. So very efficient building, big solar panel array, but also net positive water, meaning that building needs to produce more water than it uses. So that's a big rainwater cistern. So here locally at Georgia Tech, we have the Candida building, which was Living Building certified. I believe it's the first in the Southeast. It's a super cool building. But I mean, that's getting into what's called like regenerative architecture. So how do you like design and construct a building so that you're actually having a positive impact on the environment rather than it just being better than standard?
That idea of regenerative or replenishing is critical to the circular economy concept, right? That's one of the design principles, is that it is, when you're producing it, you do it in a regenerative way. And I think you're bringing up another point that's going to be of increasing interest. And I'd like to wrap with just a couple of trends that we might look out on. I think water is going to be the next big wave, no pun intended. Emissions have been dominating the conversation. We see this week, especially, it's climate week. So there are a million companies announcing their net zero goals, which may or may not be actually based in science, but that is going to be, I think, followed fast by water. And if water isn't on your radar now, both water that you may be using, or water impacts of the building or upstream in your building materials, I think it's going to be incredibly important, and something, again, like a look now at, well, what might we measure to tell the story of our water impact? What are the frameworks out there that will help us do that? Because we'll all need it soon, for sure. Actually, any other trends that we should look out at on ESG reporting over the next 12 to 24 months? I have a couple in mind, but I'd love to hear from you, Abe.
none that immediately come to mind. I mean, I think water, what you just said is like, it's huge, especially Southwest, but also here in Atlanta and Georgia, where we're perennially in our water wars with our neighbors.
Yes.
And so there's the one issue of just like, there's the cost of water, there's the sewer fees, right? So there's an economic case for using less water for sure. It's a limited resource, but then there's also this concept of the energy water nexus. So I remember when early into the time I moved to Atlanta, we experienced a drought. So this was like right 2005, 2006. And the number one user of water was Georgia Power for their big coal plants. And so they were using massive amounts of water. So when you look at energy use, there's this embodied water that kind of goes along with it. It takes a lot of water in many regions of the country to produce energy. And then to produce water that's drinkable, it takes a lot of energy. There's a lot of embodied energy in it. So when you reduce your water consumption, there's this kind of, at the municipal level, energy savings. And when you reduce your energy use in many regions of the country, there's also water associated with that as well. There was a campaign for like CFL bulbs showing like gallons of water that were being saved in Metro Atlanta because of the affiliated water usage at Georgia Power. So, I think just seeing how complex these systems are and how interrelated things are. On the one hand, everything is messy, but the flip side is it's really cool because you end up with these multiple win-win-win scenarios because it's so interconnected.
Yes. And if you throw community health, public health, environmental justice, and those kinds of challenges into that sort of gumbo that you're creating there, you really do have an opportunity for an amazing sort of multiplier effect if you can solve the really knotty challenges that sit at the heart of it all. And I think not many are as well positioned to do that as those who are building buildings and, more importantly, building communities. So it's a fascinating opportunity. I think, oh gosh, we're coming up. We're coming up on our time. So Ian,
by saying thanks to you. I want to start off with a compliment from one of our attendees, Christopher Pina. Such an important combo on all multiple levels. Thank you very much. So,
thanks, Christopher. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and we do have a couple questions. They seem like they might blend in together. So let me pose these, and I think I might combine. So, how can you build a culture of embracing ESG across an entire organization from a change management perspective?
Yeah.
And then I'll follow that up with, would you mind sharing some of the key differences that you've observed between healthy cultures versus unhealthy cultures, managing well while also giving people autonomy? You don't want to micromanage and you want to give autonomy, but at the same time, you want to manage those goals appropriately. So what would be your thoughts on that?
Abe, would you like to start with any of those? Or I could start with the first question, which was like, how do you get that embracing going? But I'm sure you have some things to share there too, Abe. You want to start?
Yeah, I'll start with the healthy culture one.
Okay.
Because I can say, as a small business, we are not set up for micromanaging employees. That's not what I want to do. It's not what I enjoy doing. It's not what my business partner enjoys doing. So we actively seek out people who want to and are capable of being reasonably autonomous. But the key is you got to set people up for success, right? You got to give them the training and the tools so that they're successful. And then you need to make sure that they're achieving their goals. It's kind of like in green building inspections, one of our mantras is trust but verify. It's a similar thing with my colleagues. Like, I'm going to trust you. And then at our weekly, monthly, whatever check-ins, let's make sure things are getting done. And we've got clear project management tools so that we can see that projects are progressing as designed. But I think it's really important to empower people to get their work done kind of how they best see fit,
Excellent. Thanks, Abe. Okay, so I'll jump in with the first question, which is like, how do you get the organization to embrace it? And I think this is a challenge having worked with like a lot of Fortune 500 companies when I was at Gartner and learning about the journey that they go on, there are a few critical things that happen that start to tip it over from this is a tick the box exercise, or we have like 3 people sitting in different pockets of the organization who are really driving recycling and they're part of the business, or whatever special project they may have, to really changing it so it becomes part of your DNA. The first is this has to be championed by your CEO. And by champions, that does not mean like they write a letter and then there's a public statement on your website that says they care about sustainability and then you never hear about it again. It's got to be consistently delivered from the tone at the top that says this matters. And that message has to be delivered on a regular basis. And frankly, at this point, like I would put D&I, which may or may not be a material ESG factor for you, depending on the nature of your business. I would put that right up there with ESG or environmental impact or social impact all together. It's like if you're going to really, if you want a culture change, it has to be talked about on a regular basis, period. Otherwise, people think it's like a one-off campaign. They don't take it seriously. It's not backed up. And frankly, if people moving in and out of your organization, so if they missed the one time your CEO talked about it at last year's annual kickoff, they have no reason to believe that it's part of your culture. So tone at the top is number one. I think the next is kind of look for those local champions. As Abe was saying earlier, like you can't have one person doing this. You need to have a team. And chances are that there are multiple people sitting out there in your organization who are completely passionate and are just looking for a place where they can channel that energy. As someone who's walked into like 2 organizations as the first and senior most ESG or sustainability hire, I can tell you as soon as I get there, hands go up saying, I'm so glad you're here. What can I do? What are we going to get started? So definitely look for those champions that are scattered throughout the business and get them involved in something. I have talked to companies who've led zero waste to landfill initiatives across their global manufacturing footprint. And that is not possible without going to Abe's point, like empowering people to say, here's our goal. We got to figure out how to drive all the waste out of this factory, all the hazardous waste out of this factory. What should we do? Make them the experts. You don't have to be the expert everywhere. You can embed that or turn to the expertise of others, give them the challenge to solve, and then let them go figure it out. Give them the resources they need, give them the support, give them the executive sponsorship, but let them figure that out on their own. That way they own the results. They're the ones who will make sure it goes to the next level. They're the ones who will be able to talk to peers at the next site on how they made it happen and speak that language. And the third is bake it into your incentives. I mean, if it's not on your dashboards of your executives committee by the end of next year, you're starting to lag. I think that's what investors are going to be increasingly looking for. It's great that you have a net zero television commercial. So how many members of your management committee actually have goals tied to reducing your environmental impact? Because without that, it becomes like a sideline sort of stream of work that gets attention at certain times of year and is neglected during the rest. And it's not easy. And organizations that have done this often still have to bake it in at multiple levels in the organization. It doesn't happen all at once. But you've got to start somewhere, and people aren't getting their bonuses attached to it. It's not going to happen. It's always going to be second fiddle to our old goals for profitability, margin, or resource efficiency. So I think those are the three big levers that you have when you're trying to drive this throughout your organization.
And I'll just take that down to the construction site. It's the same thing we run into too, where, I would say sustainability, green building certifications are not new, but in some markets, there still are general contractors where it's new to them. And so we certainly have some resistance from general contractors or multifamily properties where they're like, yeah, I don't care. I don't want this, or this is BS. And so it's about, well, I get it. You have to do this. It's not my fault. Don't shoot the messenger, but finding kind of helping them see the value in it. And ideally it's somehow their compensation is being tied to it, or their performance is being reviewed on the building performance, where they're 20 re-inspections because they weren't managing their subs well and they were consistently failing their testing? Or did the project run smoothly and they hit their timeline, they hit their budget, and then they get their bonus? So a lot of our time is really explaining the value to the boots on the ground team members who may or may not fully understand the why behind this. They just think it's new, it's different, and I haven't been trained on it, so I don't necessarily like it.
No, that's exactly it, Abe. It's like the why. Why is this important? Why is this as important as everything you know already? And just baking in that time to educate and making it like not having the education be a penalty. It's like we all have a lot of Zoom calls these days, and I don't think anyone's excited about getting a thing for another meeting or another training that they have to complete. But if you can make that baked into the job and accommodate for that like learning and rewiring the organization shouldn't necessarily come at a time and cost burden to all of your employees. Like you've got to give that slack for rewiring.
Great. We've got another couple questions, and
wow.
if we can definitely go over time if Pam and Abe are able to stick around. Otherwise, they'll be able to drop.
We'll just talk faster, or I'll just shut up.
Yeah, I got a couple for you, and let's see what your thoughts are. So, from Hugh Lindsay, many large commercial and residential developers are making really ambitious net zero carbon commitments. How do you see this impacting ESG reporting and adoption? And what are your thoughts on how green financing factors in standards and disclosure?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Abe, do you want to start with anything there?
I'll say that I see the green financing as a huge driver for this industry. And so those sorts of incentives are getting the attention of a lot of developers. And so we're kind of seeing that as the why, because they're getting cheaper money or better terms on their money. So that's why they're doing it. So I think that's huge. I think that's been great for the industry. ESG reporting, Pam?
Yeah, I'll talk about the net zero goals and ESG reporting. I think we are definitely, and again, this week, you're going to see a lot of it, of declarations of net zero goals, or carbon neutral, though net zero seems to be now the new language of choice. I think what's really important before you set a net zero goal is having like a really clear understanding of your baseline and where your like the boundaries of that baseline. So we're going to start with scope 1, because like, let's be real about scope 3, like who knows what's out there? And I think it's inevitable that we need to figure it out, and that will be complicated and costly to do so. We're trying to work on tools to help make that happen, if I might make another OneTrust plug. But I think what we're going to see over the next year or so, probably either by virtue of regulation from the SEC, which is expected, we should have like a proposed rollout by the end of the year. Gary Gensler, the SEC chairman, keeps telling us that is what is coming, so we should not be surprised when we see it. But I think we're going to start to see like a sifting of like what has been a marketing campaign and what is like an actual goal that a business is prepared to deliver on and has identified some strategies by which we're going to do it. So either that's going to come through regulation, or it's going to come through just a sort of a growing awareness among pressure from investors, from customers to say like, well, how legit is this goal? Like, is it a science-based target? Because the Science-Based Target Initiative does not yet have guidelines for net zero. So I'm a little skeptical when I see those kinds of goals. I'm inspired for sure, but I've been around long enough to become like have a healthy degree of skepticism when it comes to these things, and just would urge everyone to like, if your organization is pushing for that, try to root it in science and use the Science-Based Targets Initiative to make that happen.
Awesome. We do have another question. Do you guys have some time to go slightly over?
I've got another couple minutes. Sorry,
Before I ask the question, I just want to first thank both Abe and Pam for generously giving their time to talk about this. It's been a really insightful conversation, and I'm excited to see some of the follow-up from our attendees and the questions that come through. I'll make sure to make any connections that anybody would like to make with Abe and Pam to further the conversation. So first of all, thank you both very much. I can pose this last question and you can take a stab, and I'm going to hop over to tee up our next session for the 4 o'clock hour. But thank you both very much. So final question here. Citi is more of a comment and asking for your thoughts here. Cities are competing for talent and top tier firms that are driving their cities' futures. ESG goals as part of public policy help cities be competitive on the world stage. See C40 cities in top tier. What are your thoughts on this?
Pam, any initial thoughts? And thanks, Ian. I know you've got it.
Go ahead, Abe.
I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying before about how are you going to quantify this? How are you going to track this? And so I think, yes, right. This is a great way for our city to attract corporations and corporate relocations and things like that. I'll give the example of Save Atlanta has a big initiative around producing more affordable housing. And it's turned into this kind of accounting fiasco of trying to take credit for existing efforts versus new efforts, and you're kind of shuffling money around, and it's messy. And I would say that would be kind of my initial kind of skepticism whenever I see a city trying to say, we're going to go carbon neutral or do something like that, because we need a clear framework for how we're going to do the accounting that makes sense so that people can have faith in the process and trust the process.
Sure.
Because there can be smoke and mirrors to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Any kind of development stuff can be smoke and mirrors. But I think I would point to a couple resources. One is definitely CDP's Cities Disclosure Program as sort of a baseline for what kinds of things might be measurable. I'll be honest with you, because I've been out of the community development field for a while, I haven't looked to see what the uptake of CDP's Cities program is, but I would look to that for a set of indicators. I think another is what comes to mind when I hear about the role of cities is that, like, we all have to get to a place of resilience. And I'm a former Pittsburgher. I know we have a chief sustainability officer there who's focused largely on resilience. I'm also a former New Yorker. We had a resilience office there. Like, resilience is not possible without thinking in an ecosystem mindset of, we all have to pull together, both as a city, providing the right kinds of infrastructure investments that will enable development to do its part, like all of those parts, where we place schools, how those schools are built, like all of it has to fit together. So I would encourage like cities and companies to look to frameworks that are existing. I suspect a lot of foundations have also been looking at this too, like the Rockefeller Foundation, I think, has done a lot around cities and cities of the future and resilience. So I would look to those programs, see what worked, and just enter it with that ecosystem mindset around shared goals. That's about all I have to add on that one.
I think that was great.
Well, thanks. Abe, this has been such a pleasure. We did not know each other before this session, but I've really enjoyed the opportunity meeting with you and learning from you on this. So thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. Great questions. And please connect on LinkedIn.
What I'll do is I'll put in the chat my email.
There you go.
So feel free, everyone, to reach out if you have any questions or if there's anything else I can do. I know Ian is also playing the role of matchmaker, so please reach out to Ian if there's any presenters, period, who you want to talk to. But with that, let's get to our 4 o'clocks.
Thanks, Abe. Take good care.
Bye, Pam. Thank you.
Bye.